The recovery operation for St. Jude's Hospital began at 400 hours on November 12th. Dr. Sarah Chen watched from the mobile command center as 4 members of Biohazard Response Team Delta 7 approached the sealed entrance of what Foundation records designated as SCP-2401. The building had been locked down for 39 years, and she was about to find out why. "Command, this is Delta 7 Lead. We're at the primary entrance. Seals appear intact." The voice of Captain Marcus Webb crackled through her headset, professional and measured. Sarah leaned toward the microphone. "Copy that, Delta 7. Proceed with entry protocol. Remember, we have no reliable data on internal conditions. Assume biological hazard level 4 until confirmed otherwise." She'd read the original containment file a dozen times in the past week. In October 1985, Foundation agents had responded to reports of a quarantine situation at St. Jude's Hospital in rural Pennsylvania. By the time they arrived, the entire medical staff had sealed the intensive care wing from the inside and refused to open the doors. 3 days later, all radio contact ceased. The Foundation designated the site as a potential biological anomaly, pumped the ventilation system full of aerosolized sedatives, and welded every entrance shut. Then they'd simply waited, monitoring for any signs of breach or expansion. For 39 years, SCP-2401 had remained silent. The decision to finally enter had come from Site Director Morrison himself, prompted by structural surveys indicating the building's imminent collapse. If there was something dangerous inside, they needed to secure it before it ended up scattered across 3 counties. Through the camera feed, mounted on Captain Webb's helmet, Sarah watched as the team's engineer, Specialist Rodriguez, worked an industrial cutter through the welded steel barriers. Sparks cascaded down the concrete steps like a waterfall of light in the pre-dawn darkness. The other 3 team members maintained a perimeter, their rifles tracking potential threats that hadn't emerged in nearly 4 decades. "Seals breached," Rodriguez reported. "Doors opening. Jesus, the air pressure in there is intense. Something's definitely been pumping atmosphere into this place." "Life support systems still operational after all this time?" Dr. Chen muttered, more to herself than anyone else. That shouldn't be possible. The building had been disconnected from the power grid in 1985. Captain Webb's camera feed showed the door swinging inward with a pneumatic hiss. A wave of white mist rolled out, condensation from the temperature differential. Then the smell hit them. "Oh God!" That was Agent Taurus, the team's medic. "What is that?" "Report," Sarah demanded. "It smells like bleach, ma'am. Industrial cleaner. Strong enough to burn the nose even through the respirator filters." Webb's voice remained steady, but she could hear the underlying tension. "There's something else too. Ozone, maybe? Like after a lightning strike." "Atmospheric readings?" Sarah asked. "Air quality is actually good," Rodriguez said, consulting a handheld device. "Oxygen levels normal. No toxic gases detected. Temperature is 58 degrees. The place is just cold and really, really clean smelling." "Proceed with caution. Full documentation protocol." The team moved into the entrance corridor, their helmet lights cutting through the darkness. The feed showed institutional walls painted in that specific shade of pale green that had been ubiquitous in hospitals during the 80s. Informational posters hung at regular intervals, their edges curled with age, warning about infection control procedures and visiting hours. "Fluorescent lights are still mounted," Webb observed, his camera panning across the ceiling. "But they're not active. We're running on portable illumination only." They advanced down the corridor, boots echoing on linoleum floors. Sarah noted that despite decades of abandonment, there was no visible dust or debris. The smell of bleach that the team kept mentioning seemed to have preserved the space in a kind of chemical stasis. "Command, we've reached the reception area. It's like everyone just walked away mid-shift." Webb's camera captured an administrative desk with paperwork still scattered across its surface, a coffee cup sitting next to an ancient computer terminal, a jacket draped over a chair. Date stamp on these documents shows October 15th, 1985. That matches the containment records. "Any signs of human remains?" Sarah asked. "Negative. No bodies, no blood, nothing to indicate violence or panic." They moved deeper into the facility, passing through a set of double doors into what signs identified as the quarantine wing. The smell of bleach intensified. Agent Torres gagged audibly. "The chemical odor is getting stronger," Webb reported. "Visibility is still good, but there's this constant background noise now. Humming." Sarah heard it through the audio feed, a low electrical vibration that set her teeth on edge. "Can you identify the source?" "Working on it. Rodriguez, check the electrical panels." The engineer split off from the group, his camera feed showing him approaching a metal box mounted on the wall. He opened it with gloved hands, revealing a mess of wiring that should have been dead for decades. Instead, small lights blinked in irregular patterns. "This doesn't make sense," Rodriguez said. "There's power flowing through these circuits. The building is definitely disconnected from the grid. I verified that myself before we entered. But something is generating electricity inside this place." "Backup generators?" Sarah suggested. "Would have run out of fuel in 1985. This is something else." A crackling sound interrupted them, and suddenly the corridor blazed with light. Fluorescent tubes mounted in the ceiling flickered to life, their ballasts humming with that characteristic buzz. The sudden illumination was blinding after the relative darkness. "What the hell?" Webb spun in a circle, his weapon tracking across the now visible space. "Did you do that, Rodriguez?" "No, sir. I didn't touch anything. The system just activated on its own." In the harsh fluorescent light, Sarah could see the corridor in detail for the first time. The walls were covered in something. At first glance, it looked like mold or fungus, a pale growth that spread across the painted surface in organic patterns. But as Webb's camera focused on it, she realized the texture was wrong. Too smooth, too uniform. "Get a close-up of that wall growth," she ordered. Webb approached, his camera lens coming within inches of the pale substance. It had a fleshy appearance, almost translucent in places, with visible striations running through it like muscle fiber. In the fluorescent light, she could see tiny blood vessels threading through the tissue. "Dr. Chen, is that what I think it is?" Webb's voice had lost some of its professional composure. Sarah felt ice water trickle down her spine. "Collect a sample. Full containment protocols." Torres moved forward with a sample kit, using a sterile scalpel to scrape a portion of the growth from the wall. The substance came away easily, and Sarah noticed something that made her breath catch. Where Torres had cut into it, a clear fluid was weeping from the wound. Not water, something thicker, more viscous. "The wall is bleeding," Torres said quietly. "Command, the wall is bleeding." "Get that sample sealed and tagged," Sarah ordered, fighting to keep her voice level. "Continue to the ICU. That's where the original patients were located, according to the 1985 reports." The team moved forward, and Sarah noticed that the growth on the walls was becoming thicker, more pronounced. It formed raised ridges and valleys, creating a topology that resembled the surface of a brain. The fluorescent lights continued to flicker overhead, their irregular rhythm creating a strobing effect that made the walls seem to pulse. "There's a door ahead," Webb announced. "Sign says intensive care unit." As they approached, Sarah could see through the camera feed that the double doors leading to the ICU were partially open. The growth from the walls had spread through the gap, creating a bridge of flesh-like tissue that connected both sides. It was breathing. The entire mass expanded and contracted with a slow, rhythmic motion. "Is that thing alive?" Rodriguez whispered. "Only one way to find out," Webb said. "Torres, readings?" The medic consulted his instruments. "I'm picking up a heat signature from the tissue. Temperature is approximately 98.6 degrees. That's human body temperature. I'm also detecting a rhythmic pressure pattern consistent with..." He trailed off, recalibrating his device. "This can't be right. I'm reading multiple heartbeats, dozens of them, all synchronized." Sarah activated her microphone. "Delta 7, I'm upgrading this to a Class 4 biological anomaly. Maintain maximum containment protocols. Do not make direct physical contact with the growth under any circumstances." "Understood, Command. Moving to enter the ICU." Webb pushed through the double doors, careful not to touch the tissue bridge. The space beyond stopped all 4 team members in their tracks. Through multiple camera feeds, Sarah saw what had been waiting in the darkness for 39 years. The ICU was a large open room, designed in the style of 1980s medical architecture, with a central nursing station surrounded by individual patient bays. But the familiar institutional layout had been transformed into something from a nightmare. The pale tissue growth covered every surface, walls, floor, ceiling, creating an organic cavern that pulsed with that same slow, deliberate breathing pattern. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in time with the respiration, as if the entire room was a single living organism. But it was the beds that drew Sarah's attention. There were 12 of them, arranged in a circle around the nursing station. Each metal bed frame was still occupied. "Oh God," Torres breathed. "They're still here." The patients lay motionless on their beds, but calling them patients didn't capture the horror of what Sarah was seeing. The tissue growth had consumed them, integrating their bodies into the larger mass. Their skin had become part of the walls, stretching out from their torsos in thin sheets that connected to the surrounding surfaces. Their limbs were fused to the bed frames, the metal posts growing through their flesh like trees through soil. But worst of all, they were alive. Sarah could see the subtle rise and fall of chests, the slight movement of eyes beneath closed lids. Vital signs monitors that should have been dead for decades displayed active readouts, showing heart rates and blood pressure and oxygen saturation. The numbers were stable, impossibly, horrifically stable. "Command, are you seeing this?" Webb's voice was barely a whisper. "I see it," Sarah confirmed. "Document everything. We need to understand what we're dealing with." The team spread out, each member focusing on different aspects of the scene. Rodriguez examined the medical equipment, discovering that, like the lights, it was receiving power from some unknown source. Torres attempted to identify the patients using the charts that still hung at the foot of each bed, though the names had been partially obscured by tissue growth. Agent Kowalski, the team's fourth member who had been mostly silent until now, approached one of the beds. Through his camera feed, Sarah watched as he leaned in close to examine the patient's face. It was a woman, elderly even in 1985, which would make her well over 100 years old now. Her skin had the waxy appearance of extreme age, but there were no signs of necrosis or decay. The tissue connecting her to the walls seemed to be providing nutrients, keeping her alive through some impossible biological mechanism. "Her eyes just moved," Kowalski said suddenly. "Command, I think she's conscious." "Step back," Sarah ordered. "Do not attempt interaction." But it was too late. The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing pupils that had been dilated for so long they'd lost all pigmentation. She stared at Kowalski with those white, blind eyes, and her mouth opened. The sound that emerged was not quite human, a wet, rattling attempt at speech that had been shaped by a throat that hadn't been used in decades. "Help! The plea triggered a cascade effect. Around the room, other patients began to wake. Eyes opened, mouths moved, and a chorus of broken voices filled the air. They were begging, pleading, crying out in agony that had been building for 39 years. The tissue connecting them to the walls rippled and contracted, and Sarah realized with horror that they could feel pain. All of them. Constantly. "We need to leave," Webb said, backing toward the door. "Now." But the organism had other plans. The tissue bridge across the ICU entrance suddenly contracted, pulling the doors shut with enough force to buckle the metal frames. The growth spread rapidly across the gap, sealing the team inside. "We're trapped!" Rodriguez shouted, running to the doors and trying to pry them open. "The stuff is too strong. I can't." "Use the cutting torch," Webb ordered, his training overriding his panic. Rodriguez pulled the plasma cutter from his pack and ignited it, pressing the blue flame against the tissue barrier. The substance began to burn, filling the air with the smell of cooking meat. But as fast as he cut, the growth regenerated, new tissue flowing in to replace what he'd destroyed. The patients were screaming now, their voices rising in a cacophony of suffering. Sarah realized that they could feel the cutting, that every slice of the torch was like a blade across their own skin. The organism was them, and they were the organism, separate and together, individual and collective, trapped in a biological prison that refused to let them die. "Command, we need extraction," Webb was shouting into his radio. "The entity is hostile. Repeat, the entity is hostile, and we are contained." Sarah was already mobilizing the backup team, but she knew they wouldn't arrive in time. She watched helplessly as the tissue growth began to spread across the floor toward Delta 7. moving with predatory intent. It was hunting them. "Get to high ground," she ordered. "Climb onto the nursing station, anything to get away from the floor." The team scrambled up onto the central desk, their boots slipping on the smooth surface. The tissue flowed after them like a tide, covering the floor in a carpet of pale flesh. It reached the base of the nursing station and began to climb, forming finger-like projections that grasped at the metal edges. Taurus was taking readings, his scientific training overriding his terror. The growth rate is exponential. At this rate, it'll cover the entire room in less than 5 minutes. Once it reaches us, it'll do to us what it did to them, Kowalski finished, gesturing at the patients still trapped in their beds. "We'll become part of it." Through the camera feeds, Sarah could see the full horror of their situation. The tissue was intelligent, or at least operating under some kind of collective consciousness. It wasn't just spreading randomly. It was problem-solving, finding the most efficient path to reach the team. Tendrils split and rejoined, forming a network that pulsed with that same synchronized heartbeat. "There has to be a way out," Webb said, scanning the room. "A ventilation shaft, a window, something." "There," Rodriguez pointed to a grate in the ceiling, partially obscured by tissue growth. "Air duct. If we can reach it, we might be able to crawl out." "It's 20 feet up," Taurus protested. "How are we supposed to?" "Stack the equipment," Webb interrupted. "Build a platform, move." They worked frantically, piling medical carts and equipment into a precarious tower. The tissue was at the edge of the nursing station now, its finger-like projections grasping at their boots. Kowalski kicked at them, but where his boot made contact, the tissue tried to adhere, sticky like flypaper. "It's trying to bond with our suits," he shouted. "Keep moving. Don't let it get a grip," Webb ordered. They climbed their improvised tower one by one, with Rodriguez in the lead because he had the tools to open the ventilation grate. Sarah watched through his helmet camera as he worked the screws loose, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Below him, the tissue had covered the nursing station and was climbing the equipment tower, moving faster now. "Rodriguez, faster!" Webb urged. "I'm trying. The screws are rusted. Got it!" The grate came free, revealing a dark shaft beyond. "I'm going in." He pulled himself into the duct, his bulky hazmat suit barely fitting through the opening. Taurus went next, then Kowalski. Webb brought up the rear, and just as he grabbed the edge of the opening, the tissue reached him. It wrapped around his ankle like a living rope, pulling him back down. "Webb!" Taurus reached down, grabbing the captain's outstretched hand. "Don't let go," Webb gasped. "Whatever you do, don't." The tissue contracted, yanking hard. For a moment, Taurus held on, but the force was too strong. Webb's glove slipped from his grasp, and he fell back into the room, landing hard on the equipment pile. The tissue swarmed over him immediately, covering his suit in a layer of grasping flesh. "Get out!" Webb shouted to his team. "That's an order. Get out and seal this section." Sarah watched in horror as the tissue began to find gaps in Webb's protective suit, working its way through the seals at his wrists and neck. He was fighting, thrashing against the growth, but there were too many contact points. The organism was pulling him down, dragging him toward one of the empty beds that sat between the occupied ones. "We can't leave him." Taurus was crying, trying to climb back down into the room. "You have your orders." Webb's voice was strained now, heavy with pain. "Command, do you copy?" "I copy," Sarah managed to say. "Burn it. When the backup team arrives, burn the whole wing. Don't let this thing spread." He screamed then, a sound of pure agony. The tissue had breached his suit completely, and she could see through his helmet camera, now lying on the floor, that tendrils were burrowing into his skin. "God, I can feel it. It's in my bloodstream. It's changing me. The feed cut out. Webb? Webb, respond!" Sarah was shouting now, protocol abandoned. The 3 remaining team members were crawling through the ventilation system, their helmet lights showing a path through corroded metal ducts. They could hear sounds below them, wet, organic sounds mixed with Webb's diminishing screams. Then silence. It took 45 minutes for Delta 7's survivors to navigate the duct system and emerge in an adjacent wing of the hospital. By the time they staggered out into the pre-dawn light, the backup team had arrived with industrial flamethrowers and enough incendiary material to reduce the entire quarantine wing to ash. Sarah met them in the command center, where they were being decontaminated. Through the clear plastic of the isolation chamber, she could see Torres shaking, his eyes distant with shock. Kowalski was being treated for minor injuries sustained during the escape. Rodriguez was the only one who seemed capable of coherent speech. "We need to go back for him," he said when Sarah entered the chamber in her own protective gear. "Captain Webb, we can't just leave him in there." "Captain Webb is gone," Sarah said gently. "You know what happened to him. What's happening to him right now?" "He's becoming one of them," Torres whispered. "Another patient, another piece of that thing." "We need to understand what it is," Sarah said. "Did you manage to collect any data? Anything that might help us contain this?" Rodriguez pulled a data drive from his suit pocket. "Vital signs from the patients, tissue samples Torres collected. It's not much, but it might give us something." Over the next 6 hours, as the backup team set up a perimeter and prepared to incinerate the quarantine wing, Sarah reviewed the data. What she found was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. The tissue samples revealed a parasitic organism unlike anything in Foundation records. It was partially fungal, partially bacterial, with elements that seemed almost viral in nature. But it had been modified, engineered by human hands. Genetic markers in the DNA suggested laboratory manipulation, experiments conducted in the early 1980s, when genetic science was still in its infancy. The medical records Torres had photographed told the rest of the story. St. Jude's Hospital had been conducting experimental treatments for terminal patients, using a synthetic organism designed to repair damaged tissue and extend life. The early results had been promising. Patients who should have died were stabilizing, even improving, but the organism had mutated. Or perhaps it had always been designed to do what it eventually did. It began spreading beyond its intended targets, consuming the hospital from the inside out. The medical staff, realizing what was happening, had tried to contain it by sealing the wing. They'd failed. The organism had taken them too, integrating them into its growing mass. For 39 years it had waited in the dark, keeping its hosts alive through sheer biological imperative. The patients trapped in those beds had been conscious the entire time, aware of every moment of their imprisonment. Their bodies had been maintained in stasis while their minds remained active, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. And now Captain Webb had joined them. Sarah stood outside the quarantine wing as the sun set on November 12th, watching the backup team make final preparations. The plan was simple: introduce incendiary charges through the ventilation system, then ignite the entire wing simultaneously. The heat would be intense enough to destroy the organism at a cellular level, reducing it and everything it had consumed to sterile ash. "Command, this is backup team leader Chen," her radio crackled. "Not a relative, despite the shared surname. We're ready to proceed, awaiting your authorization." Sarah thought about Captain Webb, about the 12 patients from 1985, about the medical staff who had tried to stop this thing. They'd all been alive this morning, in their own horrible way. In a few minutes, they would finally be allowed to die. "Authorization granted," she said. "Proceed with sterilization protocol." The charges detonated with a sound like thunder. Through the command center windows, she watched as flames erupted from every opening in the quarantine wing, turning the night orange. The fire burned hot enough that she could feel the heat from 200 yards away. It took 3 hours for the flames to consume the wing completely. By the time they burned out, there was nothing left but a blackened shell of concrete and twisted metal. The backup team moved in with thermal imaging, confirming that no biological activity remained. The organism was dead. Finally, completely dead. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they'd missed something. The organism had survived in isolation for 39 years, adapting to its environment, maintaining its hosts against all biological odds. What were the chances that it existed only in St. Jude's Hospital? What if there were other research sites, other experiments? She returned to the command center and pulled up the original research files that had been attached to the 1985 containment report. The experiments at St. Jude's had been funded by something called the Prometheus Initiative, a private biotech firm that had gone bankrupt shortly after the hospital was sealed. Sarah began tracing the company's history, following a trail of shell corporations and transferred assets. What she found made her blood run cold. Prometheus had operated research facilities in 7 states. St. Jude's had been just one of many sites where they'd tested their life extension organism. The others had all been shut down around the same time, but there was no record of what had happened to the test subjects or the organisms themselves. Sarah reached for her phone, dialing Site Director Morrison's direct line. It was nearly midnight, but this couldn't wait. "Morrison," the director answered, his voice thick with sleep. "Sir, we have a problem. SCP-2401 may not be an isolated incident. I have evidence suggesting there could be 6 more sites, all potentially contaminated with the same organism." There was a long pause. "Send me everything you have. I'll mobilize recovery teams immediately." Sarah compiled the data and transmitted it, then sat back in her chair, exhausted. Through the window, she could see the smoldering remains of the quarantine wing, still glowing with residual heat. Somewhere in that ash were the remains of Captain Webb and the patients he'd tried to document. They'd been given peace, at least. But if her suspicions were correct, there were more victims waiting to be discovered. More people trapped in biological prisons, kept alive by an organism that didn't understand mercy. The Foundation would find them. They would document them. And eventually they would free them the only way possible. Sarah pulled up the incident report form on her computer and began typing. The words came slowly, each one heavy with the weight of what she'd witnessed. Incident Report 2401A, Initial Recovery Operation. At 400 hours on November 12th, Biohazard Response Team Delta 7 entered the facility designated SCP-2401, previously known as St. Jude's Hospital. The team consisted of 4 members: Captain Marcus Webb, Agent Torres, Agent Kowalski, and Specialist Rodriguez. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "How did you put horror like this into clinical language? How did you reduce suffering on that scale to bureaucratic documentation?" The team discovered an anomalous biological organism occupying the quarantine wing. The organism had integrated 12 patients from 1985 into its structure, maintaining their vital functions for approximately 39 years. The patients remained conscious throughout their containment. The words looked sterile on the screen, stripped of the emotional impact. That was the Foundation way: document, contain, protect. Let the clinical language create distance from the human cost. But Sarah couldn't forget the sound of those voices, the pleading in those white, blind eyes. During the operation, Captain Marcus Webb was lost to containment breach. He was integrated into SCP-2401's structure before the entity could be neutralized. The remaining team members successfully evacuated and provided intelligence that allowed for complete sterilization of the affected area. She marked the report as complete and submitted it to the Foundation database, where it would be filed alongside thousands of other incidents, other anomalies, other horrors that the world would never know about. That was the job. That was the mission. But as Sarah finally left the command center and walked to her temporary quarters, she couldn't stop thinking about what Captain Webb had said in his final moments. The organism was in his bloodstream, changing him. What had that felt like? What had he experienced as his body was integrated into that collective mass? She knew she'd never forget his screams. They would join the collection of sounds that haunted her late at night, when the clinical distance failed and the human cost became impossible to ignore. 3 days later, Foundation teams entered the first of the 6 additional sites Sarah had identified. The abandoned medical facility in Oregon had been sealed in 1986, just a year after St. Jude's. When the teams breached the containment doors, they found the same pale tissue growth covering the walls, the same fluorescent lights flickering to life, the same impossible preservation of victims who should have been dead for decades. The pattern repeated at each location. Recovery teams entered, documented the horror, and then burned it all to ash. By the end of the month, all 7 sites had been sterilized, and the Prometheus Initiative's experiments were finally completely terminated. The final death toll was 73 patients, 32 medical staff, and 5 Foundation personnel, including Captain Webb. 73 people who had been kept alive in agony for nearly 4 decades, prisoners of an organism that wouldn't let them die. Sarah wrote the final report on SCP-2401 from her office at Site 19, where she'd been reassigned after the recovery operation. The document would be classified at the highest level, accessible only to personnel with Level 4 clearance or higher. Most of the Foundation would never know the full details of what had been found in those sealed hospitals. She ended the report with a recommendation that surprised even herself. Further research into the Prometheus organism is not advised. The potential benefits of life extension technology are vastly outweighed by the risk of uncontrolled proliferation. All recovered samples should be incinerated without analysis. Some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue. Site Director Morrison approved the recommendation without question. Sometimes, the Foundation's mission wasn't to understand anomalies. Sometimes it was simply to erase them from existence and hope that no one ever tried to create them again. Sarah closed the file and locked it in the Foundation database, where it would sit alongside thousands of other sealed incidents. SCP-2401 was contained. The threat was neutralized. The victims were finally at peace. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, she still heard their voices. The patients in their beds, begging for help that had come 39 years too late. Captain Webb, screaming as the organism took him. The wet, organic sounds of living tissue spreading across sterile hospital walls. The Foundation's motto was secure, contain, protect. They'd accomplished all three with SCP-2401. But Sarah knew that some things couldn't be contained in database entries and incident reports. Some horrors stayed with you, became part of you, changed you in ways that no amount of clinical distance could prevent. She was different now. They all were: Torres, Kowalski, Rodriguez. They'd seen what happened when science went too far, when the desire to preserve life became indistinguishable from the cruelty of refusing death. They'd walked through rooms where people had been screaming silently for decades, trapped in bodies that wouldn't let them go. And they'd carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives, another kind of parasite, another organism that refused to release its host. The only difference was that this one lived in memory rather than flesh, feeding on the moments when darkness and silence allowed it to resurface. Sarah turned off her computer and headed home, knowing that sleep would be difficult, that the nightmares would come. But that was the price of working for the Foundation. You protected the world from anomalies, and in return, the anomalies lived forever in your mind. SCP-2401 was contained. The mission was complete. But the cost, as always, was measured in more than just casualties and resources. It was measured in the weight of memory, the burden of knowledge, the understanding that some horrors couldn't be erased, only endured. And somewhere in the ash of 7 burned hospitals, the victims finally rested, freed at last from an organism that had kept them alive long past the point where life had any meaning. It was the best ending the Foundation could provide. Sometimes that had to be enough.